Apparently I've been mispronouncing Gibiate this entire season, and that's my best approximation to the Japanese. I mean, can you blame me? It does look like Gibiate or something like that, right? Anyway, when I take a look at a series like this, I won't deny I get some sort of sadistic pleasure here. Seeing an anime with such raw cultural talent backing it faceplant onto the concrete like a kindergartner on their first day when their parents push them out of the car is just too sweet to resist. This series fails so hard at everything it tries to accomplish in the most laughable ways that it would be a crime not to share with the whole world. I'm not sorry. I think I deserve a bit of low-hanging fruit every now and then. And going in depth on this clusterfuck of art style, animation, direction, sound design, planning, and story is just too tempting to pass up. Let's talk about the glorious disaster that is Gibiate. We'll start things off with a bit of history here, because how Gibiate is almost as interesting as why Gibiate, while also laying the groundwork for some later points. The producer and original creator of this series is Ryo Aoki, a television producer involved in Japanese media since 1992. He was the supervisor for Girlfriend Beta and in charge of production and story for Endride. Did you notice something in common between all the project titles I've thrown out, and maybe the fact that I didn't just call them anime? Our boy here has been diving deep into developing multimedia projects, which is a buzzword, meaning creating franchises beyond the scope of anime, manga, and light novels. Girlfriend Beta started as a heavily monetized mobile game before finding a manga and anime adaptation, and eventually shifting to console games with a PS Vita release. Endride met a similar treatment, pitched as a multimedia project with an anime and game launching within half a year of each other. That leads us into Gibiate, launched by Gibiate Project, headed up by Aoki himself. There's no further plans for a game or such at the moment when I'm writing this script, but the tone of interviews and framing for marketing doesn't give me much hope. When talking about his inspiration for the series, Aoki said, "I came up with this project at Marina Bay Sands. At this point, the only thing I decided about this project was to make it an anime for everyone around the world. As a Japanese person, when I saw this, it felt excessive, but Marina Bay Sands is attracting worldwide attention. Therefore, I felt that it was important to go overboard to make something popular all over the world. Amano-sensei's paintings have a good reputation and popularity overseas, and I felt the reason for this is because he does too many things for his paintings. I followed Amano-sensei, and this time, I thought I would also do too much. When I thought about how much I could overdo it, I wanted to borrow the power of Japanese people who were popular overseas. I thought this was necessary. Therefore, I asked Amano-sensei to join this project, and decided to gather other Japanese creative all-stars." The idea of excess and going overboard to court a worldwide audience strikes me as inherently shallow. That the creative team behind this series isn't in it for the arts, story, or any sort of passion, but simply because it's a scheme to make tons of money. Stating plainly that the only thing he knew about the project at the time of starting it was that it was going to be an anime is too telling about the raw motive. And yeah, I get it. It's a business. All studios, production companies, media conglomerates, and television stations are out to make money. But making money off a project that has a story, message, or literally anyone who cares carries the veneer of an excuse. They're making money, and that's fine, because I got something out of it. Versus the obvious cash grab of engineering a project to appeal to as wide of an audience as possible, using your home country's culture that innately has that appeal, and stringing together the flimsiest of reasons to marry those, isn't selling a product or experience like most other anime do, but the reputation of those working on it. The marketing for this series puts a heavy emphasis on the fact that they have the guy who designed the logos for each of the Final Fantasy games as their character designer and animation director, the composer behind the Is franchise is doing the music, and Sugizo and the Yoshida brothers are doing the opening theme, plus a whole host of others. With a famous calligrapher, dollmaker, bladesmith, and more collaborators, contributing their small area of expertise as artists into this bloated monstrosity for the sake of marketing to their respective fan bases. Do you see why I think that's loathsome? But it's not just that it's bad. Any series can be bad when viewed from a certain perspective. It's that this show is exceedingly bad, and these poor creatives are having their names dragged through the mud, reflecting poorly on them. God damn, does this series reflect poorly on those involved? Just from a glance, the characters and monsters look like a car crash of different styles smashed together with different tastes of what looks cool, conflicting with one another. And that stands in stark contrast with the setting, being a post-apocalyptic hellscape with killer monsters roaming around. But our main girl still finds the time to put on way too much eyeshadow and wear a miniskirt, bracelets, a top that outlines her chest and makes no sense. Looking at another post-apocalyptic series from this same season, Decadence, the characters there are all dressed plainly by comparison. Their outfits are more utility than fashion, which, when going back to this one, breaks the sense of immersion for Gibiate, because the characters are supposed to be struggling here, but clearly don't appear to be. Taking in 2 more people was a big deal for their camp at the start of the series, with Sensui the Samurai and Kenryoku the Ninja showing up, because understandably, they would need to ration out more food and living space for these 2 guys. But apparently there's enough crap to go around, as they can give him 3 little belts for his arm that the series even admits are just there for fashion. They can even give the ninja some blue hair dye to make him look more like an anime ninja. These stylistic choices show a bias for making the characters look cool, rather than making them fit into the world they inhabit, bringing doubts about how this world gels together. And that's compounded by the fact that the monsters, while being a shitty mess of CG in the series, actually look pretty interesting in the concept art on the franchise's website, still don't mesh with one another, or the setting either. For being a product of a mutating virus, you would expect to see similar features, since they're all base humans. I get that the series says people mutate differently based on a variety of factors, but even if that's the case, lizards have cartoonish human hands, a scorpion tail, a frog-looking head, and some sort of bug claws, while birds look like fantasy dragon monstrosities that have no real animalistic identifying features. Bears are just a mess of teeth, hooves, claws, and shells. They look like they're from different franchises entirely, rather than the product of a single virus in one series. Which isn't helped at all by how they move. Aside from the obvious, poorly done CG elements that the animators didn't even attempt to blend with the traditional art, no, seriously, there are parts where they're clearly overlaid on the scene, and don't look like they're actually impacting the environment at all or inhabiting that same space. Episode 5 has just some piss-poor compositing for a scene that's meant to be emotionally impactful. As a character we've known for the last 5 episodes and means a lot to Kathleen, our main character, sacrifices himself in a massive explosion. But we just see some silly CG monsters zoom right over top of him. No motion blur, no dust being kicked up, no rocks moving, nothing. That just comes off as more comical than anything else. In the series itself, they just flat out look bad. The designs are muddy, meaning you can't really tell what you're supposed to be looking at as it's zooming towards the protagonist. And there's almost no spatial awareness for how far people are away from one another in a fight, how big these things are meant to be, or even what hits where. But there's also the issue of how cartoonish they look in comparison to the rest of the series. Again, the aforementioned shitty compositing example comes to mind, and that further breaks immersion. The CG elements reek of a low budget. But that's not the only problem with the actual animation. Oh no, I wish it was just bad CG. Even the standard hand-drawn stuff that's the main style for the franchise is absolutely terrible in how it flows. Animation is plainly recycled. Literally, this scene looks like someone wasn't paying attention in the editing room and put this clip back to back with itself. I swear, I'm not doing that. But the series just rolls with it. Like the monster was supposed to come out from behind the rubble twice, and the cop was meant to shoot her gun twice. Then there's small moment-to-moment stuff, like how characters lack connective motions, people snap into place at times, and way too many movements or expressions don't match what the characters are meant to be expressing. Hell, the voice actors do a better job emoting than the animation does, which is sad because I'm actually staring at one of those. Not that they're great either. Some of the voices don't really match the characters. For instance, the doctor character is entirely too relaxed for the gravity of the stuff he's talking about, mixed with an incredibly deep and old-manish sounding voice that doesn't fit his young shonen protagonist design. And on the opposite end of that spectrum are the monsters. They just have some generic screeching creature noises instead of distinct audio footprints that helps identify them or give them more character than roar, which is a shame. Because imagine the birds using a high-pitched echolocation sound, the lizards using a Komodo dragon hiss, and the bears using like a guttural roar or maybe like something akin to a boar. That'd pump up their personality tenfold, giving each a distinct voice. Many sound effects outside that are repetitive with poor mixing too, adding more to the issue of not getting a good sense of scale for many of these fight scenes. That all makes for an audio mess, on top of the visual cancer that is watching this series. Which leaves me asking, what the hell am I watching this anime for? Most would argue this story being presented, but that's good for a laugh. I mean, literally, what the fuck is this? A samurai, a ninja, and a monk walk into a time warp sounds like the setup for a shitty joke, and unfortunately, there is no punchline. Kathleen finds Sensui and Kenroku fighting a newly transformed Gibiate, but for what reason? What was she out doing? This leads to an entirely coincidental meeting, which feels forced because no one has a reason to be there. They stumble on this monster, and instead of running from something so foreign to them, they decide to fight it unarmed? Kathleen saves them using a taser, and later swords cut them up no problem, but machine guns have a hard time? How much of a threat are the Gibiate when they're so arbitrarily easily mowed down by people with swords, but guns apparently don't do anything? That leads to some poor implications about how the world got into this situation that literally tanks and jets with missiles couldn't fight these things, but some samurai, a ninja, and a monk from the 1600s using technology about as old as the human race can. Or how about getting gasoline in a world that's gone to crap without the industrial infrastructure to support the manufacturing of it? Those are small world-building problems that add up. Like, how are they getting electricity, power, food, and everything else they need in this ruined world? But more than this setting, characters just have no reason to do anything they do in this series. Kathleen just jumps in to help Sensui and Kenroku because she needed to for the plot to move forward. And that sets the tone early on. People doing shit because the plot demands it. The Gibiate destroy the camp because the plot demands it. The doctor looks shady because the plot demands it. The group meet their new members out in the middle of nowhere because, yeah, I'm sure you get it by now, the plot demands it. Everyone just rolls with the ever-changing situation without establishing the norm of the world or group. People just brush off the mysterious time travel as anything could happen now that humans are mutating into monsters. But no, it's just a series of coincidences from the outset, and that's poor story writing. Audiences shouldn't feel that random twists of fate guide the plot forward, since, that generally removes agency from the characters. And if they're practically invincible, then that looks like plot armor. And rather than get to know our group, I guess hop in the RV because this is now a road trip show. Not that that means anything, because from a practical standpoint, nothing actually changes from the dynamic, besides a thinning of the herd. All the people in the camp were just fodder to make us feel sad, I guess. Characters that are introduced as semi-important, like the army guys or the old man from the start, have no defining traits before dying. And what does that tell me? Well, they're clearly plot tools to make the cast feel bad without any audience investment. Yes, that's right. They were obvious plot devices to arbitrarily raise the stakes. This old man just gave this dude a sword, and these army guys just argued with Sensui. So let me ask, why should I care when these people die? Even the main cast lacks strong personality traits. And when I say that, I mean I don't really know who they are. I don't really know what drives them forward beyond not wanting to die. And yeah, who wouldn't? But why should I care about these people specifically for that reason as opposed to the people who died in the camp? With such a generic motivation, that doesn't really make them special now, does it? When everyone in the world has the same motive and no other real standout aspects to their personality, it leads to a bland cast. Kathleen wants to help the doctor make a vaccine, but Sensui, Kenroku, and the rest of them are just there to keep her safe. And she has zero agency in her goal, since, it's the doctor making the vaccine. In short, the plot has no arc or direction since there's no tangible change in the status quo, as the situation is the exact same. It's just wandering and fighting, and too much fighting at that, probably, since an action scene is shoehorned into every episode instead of allowing emotional beats to linger. Monsters are a raw, unrefined obstacle placed into this with no real relevance to the world or characters. Hell, the disease could have just been a devastating plague that killed everyone outright, and nothing really would have changed besides less fighting. And all of this is a product of the main problem with this series: direction. Every decision about how this show came together, casting the voice actors who don't fit their character designs, god-awful CG that doesn't blend with the main animation, sound design that muddles the product, to how the story moves from scene to scene, has this as its root cause. When it's the director's job to ensure that everything comes together, naturally they're to blame when it doesn't. In the fight scenes, for instance, the main attraction of the series, how the camera follows the action, or in this case doesn't, is probably the biggest problem for a show that sells itself on that aspect. It cuts too quick for strikes so you can barely follow what's happening, and that's not at all helped by the plastic CG models barely reacting. The camera doesn't focus on the action actually happening, and framing is a huge concern with how many close-ups there are. Shot composition doesn't enhance the story in this case, as too often, subject's in a weird position, either too close so you have no idea what they're talking about or to whom they're talking, and that spatial problem I keep talking about is mostly blamed here. A lack of scene-setting shots or wide shots to show where everyone is and what they're doing helps the audience keep track of what's going on. And to top off this mediocrity, the show doesn't know how to end scenes, so it often just cuts to a title before going to the next.
僕は初監督ということで今回やらさせていただいてるんですけれども、いろんな作業を進めていく段階で、いろいろ足りないところとか、いろいろ非常に感じて反省している毎日なんですけども、絵描きの時からやっていたことですので、監督としても、そこに関しては非常に自分の持ち味として。
First-time director Komino Masahiko has only done animation direction and storyboarding before this project. That's someone who should have an idea of how to tell a story visually due to his extensive experience laying out scenes and moving through them with animation, connecting the big key moments, hence why those are called keyframes. Get it? However, he's shown that he sucks at stringing together a story coherently, due to his piss-poor direction of keeping the basics of cinematography in check. Are there reasons for this? Him not being the animation director and having someone with a bigger sway in the industry, as well as one of the project heads in charge of that, could mean that he was outranked, in essence, with his input just flat out being rejected. That seems like a stretch to me and I can't really verify that, but it is plausible. I don't know if he'll take the director's seat again, but if he does, I hope he can step up and prevent a series from falling apart as badly as this one. Could all of the issues relating to animation, sound design, and even direction fall onto budget constraints due to the sure-to-be mountain of consulting fees with all these creatives lending their names to this series? Or could we blame the pandemic for ruining this one by forcing people to work from home, or maybe even imposing unforeseen constraints on production? Possibly. Those are all logical explanations, but I'm not willing to give it the credit. Those are all excuses. And remember, this series was envisioned as a piece of excess. If they didn't have the budget to back that mentality up, that's a major issue with planning, which again falls back onto the director and producers. This series began production in 2019 too, and was probably a good deal done before the pandemic actually hit. So in conclusion, Gibiate is an absolute abomination this season that's just not worth your time or consideration. You could find about a million other action series that have similar themes that are much better executed. And this one is probably going to go down as a massive failure. Hey, you made it to the end of the video. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, share, and do all the other YouTube stuff to help the channel grow. And if you really want to support me, you can head on over to my Patreon to pick up some extra perks like voting on what I do next. And speaking of Patreon, I'd like to give a special thanks to Volcarona for their continued support. Thanks for watching.